Today I'm going to tell you the story of Robert Freeman, a runaway slave who risked everything when he led a desperate charge against Confederate forces in the final days of the Civil War. Facing execution if captured and prejudice from his own side, Robert found himself at a crossroad where following orders meant certain death for his men, but no one expected what would happen next. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening from. The Price of Freedom. Robert Freeman ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. The November air was crisp and cold in his heaving chest as he plunged through the dense South Carolina underbrush. Behind him, the baying of hounds echoed through the pines, their voices carrying on the night air, hungry, relentless, closing in. 3 days since he'd fled the Wilkinson plantation. 3 days of little food and less sleep, guided only by the North Star and the desperate hope of reaching Union line. Word had spread among the slaves. The Yankees were pushing into South Carolina, and with them came the promise of freedom. Robert paused at the edge of a small creek, his breath forming cloud, the chill air. He was 23 years old, tall and strong from years of field labor, but even his strength, the hounds were getting closer. He had maybe 10 minutes, if that. The only chance. He waded into the icy creek, wincing as it rose to his waist, then began moving downstream, careful to keep his head above water. Old Moses, who had tried to escape twice before they whipped him to death, had told Robert's trick. Water confused the hounds, the scent trail. "Lord, let it work," Robert whispered, his teeth chattering as he moved through the numbing water. After half a mile, he emerged on the far bank, his limbs heavy with cold. The voices of the hounds had faded somewhat, but they weren't gone. They would pick up his trail again eventually. He had to keep moving. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky pinks and golds, Robert caught sight of something through the trees. A road. He hesitated. Roads meant danger, but he was exhausted, disoriented. If this road led north, the sudden thunder of hooves made his decision for him. Riders. At least 3, moving fast. Robert dove into a dense thicket, pressing himself against the cold earth. As the horsemen, through gaps in the foliage, he glimpsed gray uniform, Confederate cavalry on patrol. He held his breath, not daring to move until the sounds of their faded completely. Then, heart pounding, he crept toward the road, staying within the cover. The road ran roughly east to west. Which way was north? The rising sun told him east, so he would need to follow the road west, then cut north. As he walked, keeping to the tree line, memories of the plantation rose unbidden. The overseer's whip opening up his back when he was 16, crime of teaching, the auction block where his mother had been sold away, when the daily indignity, the endless labor, the crushing weight of knowing he was not a man. By midday, the November sun had warmed the air slightly, but Robert's clothes were still damp, and hunger gnawed at his belly. He had eaten the last of his stolen cornbread the previous night. Now he moved more slowly, conservation of energy taking precedence for speed. The sound came so suddenly he had no time to hide, a wagon approaching from behind. Robert tensed, ready to bolt into the woods when he saw it, a flash of blue. The driver was wearing a Union uniform. Robert stood frozen in indecision. This could be salvation or a trap. The Confederates sometimes used captured uniforms to deceive. But if it was truly a Union soldier, the wagon drew closer, a simple farm cart pulled by a single horse. The driver was indeed wearing blue, an older white man with a graying beard. Beside him sat a younger black man, also in uniform. Before Robert could decide whether to show himself, the black soldier spotted him. "Hold up, Sergeant," the man said, touching the driver's arm. "There's someone there." The wagon slowed to a stop. Robert stood rooted to the spot, heart hammering in his chest. "You there," called the white sergeant. "Step out where we can see you." Slowly, hands raised, Robert emerged from the tree line. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse from thirst, "I'm seeking the Union lines. I've escaped from the Wilkinson plantation." The black soldier studied him intently, then nodded to the... "He's one of us, all right. Look at his back." Robert's tattered shirt had torn during his flight, exposing the lattice of old scars that marked him as a slave who had felt the overseer's... "Get in. We're heading back to the 54th's camp. You'll be safe there." "The 54th? He climbed into the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, a colored regiment. "I'm Corporal James Henry Lewis." He offered a... "Here, you look half dead from..." Robert drank the lukewarm water. The sweetest thing he'd... "Massachusetts? We're a long way from home." Lewis smiled. "This is a Massachusetts regiment, but most of us aren't from there. Some are free men from the north, others are former slaves like you." The war is changing, Freeman. They're letting us fight now. Fight. The concept seemed impossible. Slaves were forbidden from handling weapons under penalty of death. That's right. President Lincoln authorized it last year. There's a dozen colored regiments now, maybe more. Lewis's face grew serious. It's not easy. White soldiers don't always treat us as equal. Some officers are better than others, but we're proving ourselves. At Fort Wagner, we showed them all what we're made of. The wagon hit a rut, jolting Robert from his exhausted day. I can fight. I want to. Sergeant Miller, the driver, spoke up. You're in no shape to fight anyone right now, son. First, we get you fed and rested. Then, we'll see about making you a soldier. As the wagon trundled toward the Union encampment, Robert gazed at the horizon. For the first time in his life, he was traveling as a free man. The price of that freedom might be high. He knew the Confederates executed captured black soldiers rather than treating them as prisoners of war, but he would gladly pay it. Freedom was worth any. The Union camp appeared as they crested a small rise, a sprawling collection of white tents arranged in neat rows with blue-uniformed men moving about. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking food filled the "Welcome to your new home," Lewis said as they approached the sentries. "At least until we move on or the war ends." "Which will come first?" Robert asked. Lewis and Sergeant Miller exchanged a glance. "Hard to say," replied. "We're pushing into the South now, but it's slow going. The Rebs are dug in tight, especially around Charleston. That's where we're headed next. Charleston, the very heart of secession, less than 30 miles from the Wilkinson plantation." Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. To return so close to the place of his enslavement, it was both terrifying and strangely fitting. "If we take Charleston," Lewis added, "it'll break their spirit. But it won't be easy." As they passed through the camp perimeter, several white soldiers stopped to stare at Robert, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. But others, particularly the black soldiers, offered nods of recognition and welcome. "Colonel Shaw's a good man," Lewis said, noting Robert's unease. "Treats us with respect. Not all officers are like him, but he sets the example." At the mention of the colonel, Sergeant Miller's face clouded briefly. "He was indeed," he corrected quietly. Lewis's expression fell. "Was. I forget sometimes." He turned to Robert. "Colonel Shaw fell leading us at Fort Wagner, buried in a mass grave with his men by the Confederates. They thought it would shame him. Being buried with Negroes shows what they know about the man." They stopped near a cluster of tents marked with a simple wooden sign, Company B, 54th Massachusetts. Men gathered around, curious. "Another recruit?" A tall soldier sergeant. "Found him on the Beaufort Road. Escaped from a plantation near Charleston." The sergeant looked Robert up and down. "Get him sorted." "What's your name, recruit?" "Robert," he standing at "Robert Freeman." A murmur with the gathered soldier by knowing smile. "Freeman," the sergeant, a hint of approval in his voice. "Well chosen." Robert hadn't intended it as a taken name. It was what his mother had called him before they sold her away. But he understood the significance. He was Freeman now, in more ways than one. "Get him some food and dry clothes," the sergeant ordered. "Tomorrow we'll see if he's fit to be a soldier." As Lewis led him toward the mess tent, Robert caught snippets of conversation from the men around him. They spoke of battles fought, of comrades lost, of the long road to Charleston. They spoke as soldiers, as men with purpose and dignity. For the first time in his life, Robert Freeman dared to hope that he might become such a man himself. Men of valor. "Again!" barked Sergeant Wilson, his face impassive as he watched Robert reload the Springfield rifle. 6 weeks had transformed Robert Freeman. Regular meals had filled out his once gaunt frame. The uniform he wore, though patched in places, fit him with a dignity he had never known in plantation. His hands, once calloused from cotton fields, now bore new calluses from marching, drilling, and endless weapons. Robert bit the paper cartridge, poured the powder down the rifle barrel, and rammed the bullet home with practice. He was faster now, still not as quick as some who had been soldiers longer. "Better," Wilson admitted grudgingly. "Not good enough. A Johnny Reb can get off 3 shots while you're still fumbling with your ramrod." "Yes, Sergeant," Robert replied, hiding frustration. He had been working harder than anyone, rising before dawn for extra practice. Some nights his hands cramped so badly from drilling that Lewis had to help him straighten his fingers. "Again," Wilson checking it. "And this time? Don't waste movement." As November had given way to December, the 54th Massachusetts had pushed deeper into South Carolina, part of a larger Union force maneuvering toward Charleston. They were camped now near the Coosawhatchie River, just inland from the coastal islands the Navy had already secured. The weather had turned unseasonably warm, and sweat trickled down Robert's back as he reloaded once more. This time his movements were fluid, economical. The rifle came up smoothly, aimed at the crude target, a straw-stuffed uniform jacket pinned to a tree. "Fire!" Wilson. Robert squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, smoke billowing around him. When it cleared, he could see he had hit the target just left of center. "Not dead, but he'd remember you." A rare half-smile crossed his weathered face. "You'll do, Freeman. You'll do." Coming from Wilson, it was high praise. The sergeant had fought at Antietam and Gettysburg before transferring to the 54th. He drove his men hard, but treated them fairly, more than could be said for some white officer. As Robert cleaned his rifle, Lewis settled beside him at the campfire. "Word is, we're moving out tomorrow," said quietly. "Officers' meeting just broke up." "Where to?" Robert asked, rubbing oil into the rifle's wooden stock. "Honey Hill. The Confederates have artillery there, controlling the road to Charleston. Navy tried shelling it, but the Rebs are dug in too deep." Lewis paused. "It'll be your first real fight." Robert nodded, feeling a complicated mixture of dread and anticipation. He had trained for this, prepared himself mentally. Yet the reality of facing enemy fire, of possibly killing another man, weighed heavily. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. Lewis considered the question seriously. "Yes, only a fool wouldn't, but I'm more afraid of letting down the men beside me." He gestured to the camp around them, where soldiers cleaned weapons, mended uniforms, wrote letters home. "We're fighting for more than just the Union, Freeman. We're fighting to prove that we deserve to be free men." Robert thought of the plantation, of the overseer's whip, of his mother's face the day they took her away. "I know what I'm fighting for," he said firmly. "Good," Lewis replied. "Hold on to that tomorrow. It'll carry you through." Dawn broke cold and misty over the Union camp. Soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, breaking down tents, loading wagons, forming into marching column. Robert stood with Company B, his rifle cradled in his arms, watching officers confer over maps spread on a field table. "Listen up," Captain Thomas addressed the company, his young face serious beneath his kepi. "We're part of a larger force under General Hatch. Our objective is to secure the Charleston and Savannah Railroad at Honey Hill. Intelligence suggests moderate Confederate presence, primarily militia and home guards." A ripple of cautious optimism passed through the ranks. Militia meant less experienced fighters, not hardened veterans. "Don't get cocky," Sergeant Mann cut in. "Even a farm boy can pull a trigger." The march began at 7 with the 54th Massachusetts near the center of a column, nearly 5,000 march. Progress with frequent halts, scouts. By mid-morning, the sound of distant cannon fire rolled across. "That's our Navy," Lewis explained as they marched, shelling Confederate positions from the river. Robert nodded, adjusting the heavy pack on his shoulders. His uniform was already soaked with sweat despite the December chill. Around him, other men marched grimly forward, their faces set with determination. Near noon, the column halted suddenly. Officers rode up and down the line, conferring in hushed voices. Something had changed. Captain Thomas returned to Company B with a tight expression. "Change of plans. Intelligence was wrong. There's a substantial Confederate force at Honey Hill. Regulars, not just militia. They've established earthwork with at least a dozen artillery pieces." A murmur ran through the company. Artillery meant casualty, potentially heavy one. "We're still advancing. The 54th will form the right flank of the... We move in 30 minutes. As the captain moved on, Wilson gathered the company's sergeants and corporals. "Listen carefully. There's a causeway leading to the Confederate position, barely 50 yards wide with marsh on both sides. It's the only approach. We'll be exposed the entire way." Lewis swallowed hard. A frontal assault against entrenched positions with artillery support? Wilson's face was grim. "Those are the orders." Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In his weeks of training, he had learned enough military strategy to understand what this meant. They were being sent into a slaughter. "Why not flank them?" asked one of the newer corporals. "Go through the woods? The marsh extends too far." Wilson, "There's no other approach." He looked each of them in the eye. "I won't lie to you. This will be hard. Some of us won't make it back, but the 54th has proven itself before, and we'll do it again." As they prepared to move out, Robert checked his ammunition one last time. 60 rounds in his cartridge box, bayonet fixed and secure. His hands moved automatically, his mind strangely at the danger. Lewis appeared at his "Stay close to me. First battle is always..." "I'm ready." Robert's and racing heart suggested otherwise. The order came down the line. Forward march! 5,000 men began moving toward Honey Hill. As they drew closer, sporadic artillery fire intensified. The first shells exploded among the advancing Union troops, sending dirt and deadly fragments flying. Men fell, some crying out, others suddenly terribly silent. Medics rushed forward, dragging the wounded to safety, whereupon the advance continued, inexorable. Then came the first rifle fire, a ragged volley from Confederate skirmishers hidden in the trees ahead. Bullets whined past Robert's head, thudded into the ground around him, struck men in the line with sickening impacts. "Keep moving!" Wilson shouted above the din. "Close ranks!" Robert marched forward mechanically, stepping over fallen comrades, his eyes fixed on the causeway ahead. Through drifting smoke, he could make out the Confederate position now, a hill crowned with earthworks, gun emplacements visible along its crest. As the 54th reached the causeway, the full fury of the Confederate defense was unleashed. Cannon fire swept the narrow approach, while hundreds of rifles poured lead into the advancing Union troops. "Deploy into line," came the order. Company B spread out as much as the narrow causeway allowed, which wasn't much. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, perfect targets. "Return fire!" Robert raised his rifle, aimed at the distant earthworks where muzzle flashes marked Confederate positions, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he was already reaching for another cartridge, reloading, just as Wilson had drilled into it. Around him, men were falling at a terrifying rate. A soldier beside him pitched forward, with a bullet through his throat. Lewis staggered but kept his feet, blood streaming from a grazed cheek. "Forward!" Captain Thomas's voice somehow carried over the thunderous noise. "For the Union!" They advanced into hell itself, each step bringing them closer to the Confederate guns. Robert fired, reloaded, fired again, moving forward by sheer force of will. His world narrowed to the simple, terrible rhythm. Load, aim, fire, step forward. Load, aim, fire, step forward. And somewhere in the chaos of battle, Robert Freeman, once a slave, now a soldier, found something unexpected, the calm certainty that whatever happened here today, he was, at last, truly free. The charge, smoke, and thunder consumed the world. 2 hours into the battle at Honey Hill, the Union advance had stalled halfway to the Confederate earthworks. "Hold the line!" Captain Thomas shouted. "Reinforcements are coming!" But Robert saw the truth in the captain's. No reinforcements were coming in time. "Running low on ammunition, Sergeant," someone called to Wilson. "Make every shot count." Robert had 3 rounds. Men were dying by the minute, and for what? They couldn't advance or retreat without being cut down. Captain Thomas crawled. "We've got orders to hold position until artillery support arrives." "When will that be, sir?" Wilson asked. "An hour, maybe 2. A shell exploded nearby. When the air cleared, Captain Thomas lay motionless, a jagged piece of metal protruding from his chest. "Captain's down!" Wilson checked for a pulse, then shook. Command fell to Wilson now. He surveyed what remained of their position with grim calculation. "Sir," Robert said, "the marsh to our right, it's impassable." "Not all of it. I worked these lands before. There's a game trail slaves use. It would bring us behind that stand of pines." Robert pointed to trees, flanking the Confederate position. "We could hit them from the side." Wilson considered this. "How many men?" 20, maybe 30. Another volley cut down 3 more Union soldiers. "Do it," Wilson finally said. "Take Lewis and 20 volunteers." "Sir," Lewis protested, "that's a suicide mission. This whole damn battle is a suicide mission. At least this way some might live." Robert gathered 22 volunteers quickly. "We move fast and quiet," he told them. "Step exactly where I step." They slipped away during the next artillery barrage. Robert led them through the marsh, finding the nearly invisible trail by memory. Water rose sometimes to their waists. Every step risked sinking into mud or alerting Confederate lookout. 20 minutes later, they reached the pines. Through the trees, they could see Confederate artillery crews working frantically. "We hit them hard and fast," Robert would aim for the artillery crews first, then officers. Robert fired at a Confederate artillery officer. The man dropped silently. "Charge!" Robert shouted, and 23 soldiers burst from the tree line. The Confederate flank erupted in confusion. Robert's men were upon them, firing at point-blank range, then using bayonets and vicious. Robert faced a young Confederate lieutenant. The lieutenant raised his pistol, but Robert was faster, driving his bayonet forward. The blade sank deep, and the young officer's eyes went dim. The desperate gamble worked. 3 artillery pieces had been captured. "Turn the guns!" Robert shouted. used their own cannon against them. Two former slave blacksmiths quickly figured out how to operate the captured pieces. Within minutes, Confederate artillery was firing on Confederate positions. From the causeway, Wilson seized the opportunity. "Forward! Support Freeman's position!" The Union soldiers surged ahead, catching the disorganized Confederates in a devastating crossfire. The battle for Honey Hill had turned. As sunset cast long shadows across the bloody field, Robert stood atop the captured earthworks. Of his 22 volunteers, only 14 remained. Sergeant Wilson approached. "Freeman, General Hatch wants to see you." Robert followed Wilson to a hastily established command post. "This is him, sir," Wilson said. "Private Robert Freeman." General Hatch looked up. "Your flanking maneuver saved this battle, Private." "Thank you, sir." It was also a direct violation of orders. "Captain Thomas was killed, sir," interjected. "As senior NCO, I authorized—" "The idea was mine, sir," Robert. "I knew the terrain. I convinced Sergeant Wilson." The general's eyes narrowed. "You're a former slave?" "Yes, sir, from near Charleston." "Well, Private Freeman," General Hatch for a moment, "it seems the Union Army owes you a debt. I'm promoting you to corporal, effective immediately." As they left, Wilson shook his from slave to corporal in less than 2 months. That might be some kind of record. Robert didn't reply. He was thinking of the Confederate lieutenant he had killed, of the men who had died following him, of Captain Thomas. Victory had come at a terrible price. But then he thought of the plantation, of the whip, of his mother. Freedom always came at a price. The question was whether one was willing to pay it. The reckoning. 3 weeks after Honey Hill, the Union Army continued its slow advance toward Charleston. The victory had secured a crucial position, but the Confederate forces had regrouped, establishing new defensive lines closer to the city. Robert Freeman, now wearing corporal's stripes, led a 6-man patrol through pine wood, bordering a plantation he recognized all too well. Wilkinson, his former prison. Strange how different it looked through a soldier's eyes rather than a slave's. "Keep alert," he told his men quietly. "Rebel scouts have been spotted in this area." Lewis, now a corporal himself, moved beside him. "Feels odd being back here?" Robert nodded. "Like walking through a nightmare, but this time I'm awake." Patrol route would take them near the plantation. Intelligence wanted information. Confederate troop move, and Wilkinson's hilltop home offered an excellent vantage. As they neared the edge of the woods, Robert raised his hand, signaling a halt. Through the trees he could see the white-columned house. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. "Circle around. We'll approach from the rear." They moved silently through the underbrush. 6 months ago, Robert would have been whipped for even setting foot in these woods without permission. Now he commanded white and black soldiers alike, all following his orders without question. At the rear of the house, they paused again. No guards were visible, but a saddled horse was tied to the porch rail. "Officer," Lewis mouthed silently. Robert shrugged. "Could be anyone." "Johnson, Barnes, cover the back door. The rest with me." They slipped across the open ground to the... Robert motioned 2 men to take position at the windows while he and Lewis approached the door. With a nod to Lewis, Robert kicked it open, rifle raised. "United States Army!" Inside, a man spun toward them, reaching for a pistol on the table. Robert recognized him instantly. Matthew Wilkinson, the plantation owner's son, now wearing a Confederate major's uniform. "Don't," Robert warned, his rifle aimed at Wilkinson's chest. Wilkinson froze, his hand inches from the pistol. His eyes widened as he recognized Robert. "Freeman?" Disbelief flooded his face. "My father's Freeman?" "Not anymore," Robert replied coldly. "Corporal Freeman, United States Army. You're now a prisoner of war, Major." Wilkinson's shock gave way to fury. "A slave in uniform? This is an abomination." "Hands behind your head," Lewis ordered. "Now." Slowly, Wilkinson complied, his eyes never leaving Robert's. "My father will have you hanged for slaves who take up arms against their masters." "I'm not a slave," Robert cut him off, "and you're not my master. The law says otherwise." Robert stepped closer. "The law is changing, and your side is losing." Lewis quickly searched Wilkinson, removing his pistol and a folded map from his coat. "Patrol routes," he said, examining the map, "and artillery position. Intelligence will want this." "Treason," spat. "You'll all hang when order is restored." Robert ignored him. "Secure him. We're taking him back to headquarters." As they marched Wilkins through the wood, Robert's mind churned. This man had watched him being whipped, had ordered it once himself, when Robert had failed to show proper deference. The power dynamic between them had halfway back to Union lines stopped. Wilkinson sat on a fallen log, hands bound behind him, glaring at, "You think putting on that uniform makes you a man? You'll always be property. Always. Your world is. And what world will replace it? One where people like you give orders to—" Wilkinson laughed bitterly. "It will never last." A distant crack interrupted them, a branch breaking somewhere in the forest. Robert signaled his men to take defensive positions. "Patrol coming," Lewis whispered. "Confederate, by the looks of it." Through the trees Robert could make out gray uniforms, at least a dozen men moving in their direction. They hadn't been spotted yet, but they would be soon. "We're outnumbered," Robert decided. "We need to move." As they gathered to retreat, Wilkinson suddenly shouted, "Here! Rebels! Over here!" Before anyone could silence him, he kicked out at the nearest Union soldier, toppling him, and began running, despite his bound hands. "Halt!" Robert raised his rifle. Wilkinson kept running, still shouting, "Yankees in the woods!" Robert aimed. Wilkinson stumbled, fell, and lay still. "Move!" Robert ordered his men. "Back to our lines! Now!" They fled through the forest as Confederate bullets began splintering the trees around them. Robert led them along a creek bed, using the same evasion techniques that had served him during his escape from slavery. After an hour of hard travel, they reached Union pickets. Only then did Robert allow himself to process what had happened. He had killed Matthew Wilkinson, the man who had once held power of life and death over him. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a hollow certainty that it had been necessary. At headquarters, General Hatch reviewed the captured map with interest. "This intelligence is invaluable, Corporal. The prisoner? Killed while attempting to escape and alert Confederate forces, sir," Robert reported. The general studied him for— "I see. Unfortunate, but these things happen in war." He folded the map carefully. "You've proven yourself again. I'm recommending you for promotion to sergeant. The 54th needs good, non-commissioned officers." "Thank you, sir." Later, by the campfire, Lewis found Robert sitting alone, staring into the flame. "Sergeant Freeman," he testing the sound of it, "has a good ring." Robert nodded absent. "You thinking about Wilkinson?" "He said I'd hang for what I did today, for a slave taking up arms against it." Lewis sat. "That world is dying. Men like Wilkinson are the last." "Maybe. But their ideas will live on." "Oh, will ours," Lewis countered. "That's what we're fighting for, isn't it? Not just to end slavery, but to build something better." Robert looked up from the fire. In the distance, he could see Charleston, the city where he had been born in bondage, where his mother had been sold away, the city that symbolized everything he had fought against. "Yes," said finally, "something better." 2 months later, Charleston fell to Union forces. Robert Freeman, now Sergeant Freeman, marched into the city with the 54th Massachusetts, the stars and stripes flying above them. As they passed the slave market where human beings had once been bought and sold, black soldiers broke ranks to destroy the auction, tearing it apart with their bare hands. Robert watched, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders. The price of freedom had been high, paid in blood and sacrifice by thousands of men, black and white. But standing there, in the heart of the defeated Confederacy, he knew it had been worth it. The cannons had fallen silent, and in that silence, a new world was struggling to be born.